Shashi Tharoor is an Indian Member of Parliament, former Indian Minister of State for External Affairs, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, and a prize-winning author. He was in Washington, D.C. on October 7th as part of his tour to promote his latest book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century. Today we have some clips from a reception given to him by the Indian National Overseas Congress, USA, at the Willard Intercontinental in Washington, D.C.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together for the star of this evening, Dr. Shashi Tharoor. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of a very dear person from our community. And I should say I say our community because she doesn't spare any action or activity as far as our community is concerned. She is more Indian than some of us. I'd like to call upon stage Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Department of the U.S., Ms. Alyssa Ayers. Please come. And our very own, very own first Indian American leader, delegate, majority leader now, Kumar Barve. Please come.
I should say, our fabulous Lavika. Believe me, this never would happen without this amazing woman. We owe her a big round of applause. Wonderful. Our Lavika.
And I just want to say a couple of words about the chapter. We are here promoting the ideology of the Indian National Congress. Our national headquarters are in New York, and our national president, who I would like to call upon now, George Abraham, please.
We are indeed delighted to have Honorable Member of Parliament with us today. We want to thank him especially that he has taken time out, especially from his very busy schedule in Dallas, to stop by here to have this meeting today. As a former colleague at the UN with him, I recollect him being described as a peacekeeper by day and a writer by night. Mr. Tharoor is one of those rare individuals who does a fantastic job, not only being a member of parliament serving the Thiruvananthapuram constituency at the moment, but also is an important voice in dealing with international issues. He's an award-winning author, brilliant spokesperson, and above all, a lover of rich traditions and cultures of our native land.
We have a late entrant, Mr. Shud Jasuja, Senior Vice President of the Indian National Overseas Congress, USA.
As I recall, when they told us that a very senior, one of the senior most officials at United Nations, who is the Under-Secretary General of the entire United Nations, and he wrote a book on our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who took over in 1947. And they also told us that he's a good friend of our current Prime Minister, who's 80 years old. Believe me, we were expecting an old man with wrinkled face, the thick glasses, who has authored a book on the first Prime Minister, expecting to be a boring evening. But there we saw Shashi Tharoor entering, a handsome man with his long hair, Bollywood style. I tried to copy him coming late, but couldn't grow my hair. Please welcome Honorable Shashi Tharoor with a huge round of applause.
Thank you very much for that extremely generous welcome. And let me also acknowledge these remarkable people along the podium today Kumar Barve, whom I've had the pleasure of knowing for quite a while, I think, quite a while, and it's so wonderful that all of us Indians living in this country, as I was in those days, have a legislator to look up to who's made such a significant impact in his state.
Well, thank you.
And even though I have reasons to complain that you came to India and didn't look me up, but I'll count on you repeating that visit and see what we can do to get Maryland more closely attached to India. Paul Tennessee, who's going to be leading the discussion, a well-known scholar who bears with pride the middle name of Nehru. Christine, whom I've had the pleasure of meeting for the first time this evening. Alyssa, whom I've known, we were figuring out for at least 15 years before she entered the State Department. But I'm delighted that she's taken the time in the middle of a long weekend to come and participate in this discussion. George Abraham, who has been such a dynamic and effective leader of the Indian National Overseas Congress. He helped found the forerunning body of this and has been active as secretary and vice president and various other positions before being entrusted with the leadership this year. And I'm very pleased when he persuaded me that I should make this detour to Washington. I'm pleased I was able to squeeze in and do that. Ashud, of course, after that delightful introduction, I have no idea how I'm going to live up to that, but thank you, and certainly you beat me in the dramatic entrance department, I promise. Kamasra, the treasurer, without whom, of course, the organization wouldn't function, and now lurking in the front row, Lavika Bhagat Singh, who's done so much to put this evening together. And all of you in the audience, friends, well-wishers, ladies and gentlemen. I have written a book, and I have to say that it's a book which, to my great embarrassment, the Indian publishers have not been competent enough to expedite an American edition. So the copies that were available outside are really from India. They're the Indian edition, and the US edition looks like it's going to be still some months away. But so it's kind of a premature pre-release event, if you like, that we're doing here. But what I've tried to do in many ways hasn't been attempted in India before, which is to take stock of our foreign policy in a fairly sweeping way and articulate a vision of the way in which India will relate to the world of the 21st century in the years ahead. It was an exercise worth doing because it hasn't been done before, but it's also been a subject that's occupied my mind for quite some time. My PhD thesis at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy in this country was on the making of India's foreign policy during Mrs. Indira Gandhi's first administration. And that was written in 77, 78, published in 81. It was called Reasons of State. And 30 years later, it was enjoyable getting back to some of the same concerns and seeing how much or how little had changed. But when I wrote the book, I also was not anxious to go back to writing a scholarly, academic, footnote-laden, jargon-ridden piece of scholarship just for the universities, because I felt that A, I'd been there, done that 30 years earlier, but B, what I really wanted to do was to contribute thinking that might help animate some living room conversations, in my country at any rate, and perhaps elsewhere where people are interested in how India relates to the world. And I wanted to do that because the spirit in which I was writing and the style in which I have written this book is much more that of an extended op-ed, a very long op-ed because it's 450 pages, rather than that of a scholarly work. But I did want nonetheless for there to be enough substance in the book so that it could also be of some value, at least of some interest, to those who professionally work in and study in this field. And I'm glad to see at least one academic practitioner at this podium as well. Now, what have I tried to do in this book? I've started off not so much from the perspective of a former Under-Secretary General of the UN or a former Minister of State for External Affairs, but rather as somebody who represents a constituency, Thiruvananthapuram, in the southern tip of India, far away from our national capital, which despite being the capital of Kerala is in fact 67% rural. And I asked myself, what does an ordinary voter there, what does a fisherwoman in Thiruvananthapuram get out of foreign policy? What does foreign policy mean to her? And I argue at the very beginning the proposition that foreign policy cannot just be about, people in pinstripe suits and diplomatic chancelleries about the world. It has to be focused very directly on the domestic interests of the country whose foreign policy we're looking at. In other words, the security of the Indian people, the well-being of the Indian people, and the domestic transformation of India, which is, of course, our country's overriding priority. George mentioned the Indian National Overseas Congress. I am a member of Parliament for the Congress Party, which is the party of Nehru, but also the party of Manmohan Singh, who has in many ways presided over a significant transformation in our policy. But the one unifying argument that I would make is that the underlying necessity in India of transforming our country, helping our people overcome their poverty, helping them to find the kinds of decent lives that most Americans, all Americans perhaps, can take for granted, 2 or 3 square meals a day, a roof over their heads to protect them from the sun and the rain, decent work, the opportunity to educate their children, the prospect of improving their lives. Everyone wants that, and everyone in India can't yet take that for granted. So that has to be our overriding priority. But if you look at foreign policy from that perspective, as an instrument of transforming our country, then you realize the importance, for example, the far greater importance than ideological pronouncements of things like good relations with countries which could be sources of investment for our growing economy, good relations with important trade partners, good relations with countries that are sources of our energy security. We import 80% of our energy needs. And increasingly, as our country becomes more prosperous and our consumption increases, relations with countries which could be sources of our food security, because our demand for food is going to rapidly outstrip the supply available within the country. And that, therefore, is one key perspective from which I look at policy. The second is, of course, that it's not enough for a country like India, which has had internationalism hardwired into its DNA from the very beginning of independence, when Prime Minister Nehru made his historic midnight speech at the moment of independence, the Tryst with Destiny speech, as we all know it, a speech in which he was speaking as the country was being engulfed by the flames of partition, the horrors of the violence and rioting and killing of partition with Pakistan, the destruction of property, the deaths of 1 million people, the displacement of some 13 million who crossed the new borders, billions of rupees of property damage. While all that was going on, there was Nehru standing and saying that my dreams are not only for India, they're also for the world. That he says, because all the nations of the world are knit together by bonds so indissoluble that it's not possible for us, for any one nation, to think that it can survive apart from the rest. A very prescient notion then, but so much truer in the globalized world in which we live today, 65 years later. And so I argue that that internationalism calls for India to play a more significant role as well on the global stage, that having spent many years as what one might call a rule taker in the international system, a nation which, after all, despite being, at least in theory, a founding member of the United Nations, essentially acquired its independence in a world system that had been created by others, created by the victors of World War II, who enshrined their own prerogatives and privileges, made the rules for the rest of the world that countries like India had to follow. That India, after these 65 years since independence, and with all that's happened, with its economic growth and the capacities it has developed, that India can now go from being a rule taker in the international system to something of a rule maker, a nation that can cooperate with others in helping craft the rules of the road for the world ahead. And that does call for India to be actively engaged in the international system through the United Nations and other bodies to help cooperate in the stewardship of the global commons, to deal with what the UN in Kofi Annan's day we used to call problems without passports, the kinds of problems that transcend the abilities of any one country or any one group of countries, but which actually require international cooperation to solve on their own. And I talk about the fact that India has capacities, skills, talents, and resources to do everything that we now need to face, the new problems we need to face in the 21st century, from cyberspace to outer space. And India can help very much in working out approaches in all of these areas.